Today was supposed to be a peaceful day off, until CEO Quang's phone lit up with a message from home that changed everything. Will this family emergency pull him away from Linda just when their little garden finally feels like home? Hi everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to explore Linda and CEO Quang's sweet day in her small garden, planting fresh vegetables, discovering a huge round potato, and then facing a sudden call that could shake their quiet happiness. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. This morning felt like the mountains pressed the pause button. No rushing, no pressure. Just cool air, soft birds, and that quiet kind of peace you only notice when life finally slows down. Linda stepped out of the wooden house and looked toward her little garden behind it. It wasn't big. Some beds were uneven. The old trellis leaned like it was tired, and a few weeds had already started acting like they owned the place. But the potato patch? That part looked proud. Green leaves standing tall like they were hiding something special under the soil. She tied her hair up, slipped on old sandals, grabbed a small basket, and walked into the garden like she was visiting someone she cared about. "All right," she murmured, almost smiling to herself. "Today, we fix everything." She started pulling weeds one by one, not angrily, just patiently. The soil was damp and cool, and the smell of earth made her feel grounded. She cleared dead leaves, smoothed the edges of the beds, and straightened little corners that had gone messy. It was peaceful. And that's why the footsteps surprised her. Not loud, not rushed, familiar. She turned, and there he was. CEO Quang stood by the gate with his sleeves rolled up, holding a small hoe and a pair of gardening gloves. A couple seed packets peeked out of his pocket like he'd been planning this. Linda blinked. "You came here dressed like that?" He lifted the gloves like evidence. "We're off today, right?" "Yes." "Then I'm taking a real day off." He nodded toward the garden. "One that makes my head quiet." Linda laughed softly. "You call this resting?" He stepped closer, smiling. "I call it being with you and helping." That hit her in a way she wasn't ready for. Linda was used to doing things alone, fixing, cleaning, carrying, planting, without turning it into anyone else's responsibility. But Quang didn't look like he was doing this out of pity. He looked like he wanted to be here. She finally nodded and pointed around the space. "Okay, this bed needs to be loosened. That trellis is weak. And over there, I want leafy greens." Quang scanned the garden like he was reviewing a serious project, but his eyes stayed warm. "Good. We'll do it properly." They didn't overthink it. They just started. He handled the heavy tasks, turning the soil, pulling out stones, mixing compost. Linda did the careful work, making neat rows, choosing sunny spots, spacing everything out like she'd been dreaming about this garden for a long time. At first, there was only the sound of digging and leaves moving. Then Linda glanced at him and couldn't stop herself. "You look like you've done farm work before." "I haven't," he said immediately. "Then why are you so confident?" He paused, wiped his forehead, and answered simply, "Because you're here, and I don't want you doing everything alone." Linda's hands stopped for a second on the seed packets. Her heart beat a little too loud. She pretended to focus. Tomatoes here, green beans there, mustard greens along the edge. Quang nodded. "Perfect." Linda held up one packet and frowned. "These seeds are tiny." He leaned in like he was studying something important. "Small doesn't mean weak." Linda glanced up at him. "That's your philosophy now?" He smiled, calm and sure. "I've seen it." Linda rolled her eyes, but her cheeks warmed anyway. Then they moved to the trellis. The old one was crooked and loose. Quang found bamboo poles near the shed and carried them over. Linda brought twine. They rebuilt it together. He held the bamboo steady. She tied tight knots. They worked close, and every time their fingers brushed, both of them acted like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Linda reached too quickly at one point, and the rough bamboo edge scraped her hand. "Ow!" she hissed, pulling back. Quang turned instantly. "Let me see." "It's fine," she said fast, trying to hide it behind her back. He stepped closer, voice gentle but firm. "Linda." She showed him. A small scrape, a thin line of blood. Quang didn't panic. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out a bandage like it was the most normal thing in the world. Linda stared. "You carry that?" "Yes," he said casually. "I carry what I might need." He rinsed her hand with a bit of water, then wrapped the bandage carefully. His touch was controlled, soft, like her skin mattered more than the garden. Linda swallowed. "Thanks." He looked up at her face. "Be careful. I didn't come here to watch you get hurt." Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "Then why did you come?" He paused, then smiled slightly, half teasing, half honest. "To rest properly." Linda laughed, and the tension loosened just enough for her to breathe again. By late morning, the garden looked transformed. The soil was dark and clean. The rows were neat. The trellis stood straight like a promise. It wasn't fancy, but it looked alive, like the kind of place where good things could grow. Linda brought out ginger tea, warm and sweet, and they sat on the wooden step near the beds. Their shoulders almost touched. Quang took a sip and let out a slow breath. "This is good." "The tea?" Linda asked. He looked at the garden, then at her. "All of it." Linda didn't answer. She didn't trust her voice right then. Her eyes drifted back to the potato patch. The leaves were thick and healthy, and she suddenly felt excited, like a child who knows there's a surprise waiting. She stood up quickly. "Wait." Quang raised an eyebrow. "What?" Linda pointed. "The potatoes. Look how strong they are." He stood too. "So, let's check," she said, eyes bright. "Just one plant." He hesitated. "If we dig too early, we might ruin it." "Just one," Linda begged, smiling. "Please." Quang looked at her face, hopeful, playful, glowing, and gave in like he always did when she looked like that. "Fine," he said, picking up the small hoe. "One plant. And if we destroy it, you owe me a serious apology." Linda laughed. "Deal." He knelt down carefully and loosened the soil gently, like he was unwrapping something fragile. Linda crouched beside him, holding her breath. A few seconds passed, then something pale and round appeared under the dirt. Linda's eyes widened. "Oh my." Quang brushed the soil away with his fingers. A potato. Big. Smooth. Round. Linda let out a laugh that sounded like pure joy. "It's huge." Quang stared at it, then smiled slowly, genuinely. "You did this." Linda touched it like it was a treasure. "We did." Quang lifted it carefully and held it up like a trophy. Linda clapped once and covered her mouth, still laughing. For a moment, everything felt simple. Dirt on their hands, sunlight on their faces, happiness that didn't need anything expensive. Linda opened her mouth, ready to say something honest. But Quang's phone started vibrating in his pocket. Once, then again, and again. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and his expression changed so fast, Linda felt the air shift. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Quang didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened. Then he spoke, low and careful. "It's from home." Quang kept staring at the screen like he didn't want to believe what he was reading. Linda's smile faded. The potato was still in Quang's hand, but the moment had already slipped away. "What does it say?" she asked carefully. Quang locked his phone and put it back in his pocket, but his face was still tense. "They want me to come back tonight," he said. "It's family stuff." Linda nodded slowly, pretending it didn't hurt. "Is it urgent?" He exhaled. "If they're sending messages like this, it usually is." For a second, neither of them spoke. The garden was quiet again, but now it felt different, like the silence was holding something heavy. Linda forced a small smile and pointed at the potato. "At least we found treasure first." Quang looked down at it and finally let out a short breath, almost a laugh. "Yeah, we did." He gently placed the big potato into Linda's basket, like he didn't want to break anything else today. Then he brushed dirt from his hands and looked around at what they'd finished. The new trellis stood straight. The beds were clean. The rows were ready for seeds. It looked like a fresh start. Linda picked up the watering can. "Let's finish properly," she said softly, "before the day changes again." Quang didn't argue. He just nodded. They watered the beds together. Linda poured slowly, making sure the soil drank evenly. Quang carried buckets from the side container and refilled her can without saying much. Their movements were calm, but their minds were somewhere else. When they were done, Linda grabbed a few small wooden sticks and a marker. She wrote the names of what they planted: tomatoes, green beans, mustard greens, and pressed the signs into the soil like little promises. Quang watched her. "You're always careful," he said. Linda shrugged. "If I don't mark it, I'll forget. And then I'll panic when things start growing." He smiled briefly. "I like that you plan for the future." Linda didn't answer right away. She pressed the last sign into the bed, then stood up and dusted her hands. "The future," she repeated quietly. Quang stepped closer. "Linda." She looked at him, and he could tell she was fighting something inside. Fear, doubt, old insecurity. The kind that comes when someone important might have to leave. Quang's voice softened. "Don't think too much." Linda's lips parted slightly. "I'm not thinking. I'm just..." She stopped herself. Quang lifted his hand and gently touched her bandaged scrape. "You're worrying," he said. "I can see it." Linda tried to laugh. "It's nothing." Quang shook his head. "It's not nothing. You always pretend you're fine because you don't want to be a burden." Linda's eyes dropped. "Maybe I'm just used to people leaving." That landed in the air between them like a truth neither of them could ignore. Quang's face tightened, not with anger, but with determination. "I'm not leaving you," he said. "I'm just going to handle something. Then I come back." Linda swallowed. "People always say that." Quang stepped closer until there was no space left for doubt. "Then watch me prove it." Linda looked up at him, and her eyes shined for a second like she was trying not to cry. To break the tension, she picked up another potato plant gently by the leaves. "We shouldn't dig more," she said, half joking. "We already got lucky once." Quang finally smiled properly again. "You're right. We stop before we get greedy?" Linda laughed, softer this time. "Greedy for potatoes. Greedy for happiness," he corrected. That made her pause. Quang glanced around the garden again, then pointed at the small corner near the fence. "What do you want there?" Linda followed his finger. "Maybe herbs. Something I can pick quickly for cooking." "Good," he said. "Next time, we plant herbs." Linda blinked. "Next time." Quang looked at her like it was obvious. "Every weekend," he said. "If you want." Linda's throat tightened. "You'd come back here every weekend?" He nodded. "Yes. We can make this our place. A place where things grow. A place where your heart doesn't have to be scared." Linda held his gaze. "And if your world pulls you away?" Quang didn't hesitate. "Then I pull back. I choose what matters. The words felt too big for the quiet garden, but he said them anyway, like he was tired of letting other people control the story. Linda looked down at her hands, still dirty from soil, and whispered, I don't want to ruin your life, Quang. His expression softened. You're not ruining anything, he said. You're the part that makes it worth living. Linda let out a shaky breath. Then she nodded once, as if she was making a decision inside herself. Okay, she said. Every weekend. Quang smiled. Deal. They finished by cleaning up the tools. Linda rinsed the hoe and placed it by the wall. Quang stacked the bamboo leftover neatly like he didn't want to leave a mess behind. Then he picked up the basket of vegetables and that big potato like it was the most valuable thing he owned. They cooked a simple lunch right there near the garden. Potatoes roasted with salt and chili, mustard greens with garlic. It wasn't fancy, but it tasted like comfort, like home. While they ate, Linda watched Quang quietly, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself imagine a future that didn't end in loss. But the phone buzzed again. Quang's eyes changed instantly. Linda didn't even need to ask this time. More messages? Quang checked quickly and stood up. Yeah. Linda's stomach dropped. You have to go now? He looked at her and the warmth in his eyes returned. Not this second, he said. But soon. Linda nodded, trying to hold herself together. Then go. Family is family. Quang took a step closer. Listen, he said. No matter what happens tonight, I'm coming back. I don't want you alone with your thoughts. Linda managed a small smile. I'll try. Quang hesitated, then reached for her hand. He squeezed it gently, careful around the bandage. Don't let one message destroy the peace we built today. Linda squeezed back. Promise me you'll be safe. Quang nodded. I promise. They stood there for a moment, facing the garden they'd fixed together. Fresh soil, new rows, a strong trellis, and one giant potato like proof that good things really could happen. Then Quang's phone buzzed a third time, louder, more impatient. Quang's jaw tightened. I need to go. Linda stepped back slightly, but she didn't let go of his hand right away. Quang. He leaned closer, voice low. I'm coming back. Linda watched him walk toward the gate and she tried to keep her face calm. But the moment he turned away, her eyes followed his phone, because she saw the name on the notification this time. And it wasn't just family, it was one specific person, someone who had never accepted her. Linda's breath caught, because whatever was waiting for Quang tonight, it wasn't going to be simple. And the peace of their little garden, this quiet, perfect day, might be the last calm before a storm.
Trong tập này, Linda và bà Linda theo bà và cậu cháu ra nương mía. Dưới nắng sớm, bà vừa chặt mía vừa kể chuyện ngày xưa. Dậy chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO Quang ghé đến lắng nghe và trấn an và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua. Và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu nếu thấy video hay hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.